Okay, good afternoon. While folks are still logging in, I wanted to start with some welcomes. So thank you for joining our webinar, Infrastructure, Streamlining, and Funding, What's New and What's Next? My name is Epa Hoped. I'm a partner in Steptoe's Regulated Industries Group. And I want to start with a few technical details and provide a little overview of what to expect during the next hour. So for the duration of the program, all participants will be in listen-only mode. If you have any questions, we encourage you to submit them via the chat feature at any time during the program. And please select the All Presenters option, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions received. Also, please note that the program is being recorded and a link will be shared with everyone following the program. So we have a great panel joining us today. And we'll give each guest a proper introduction during the program. But just to give you a sense of what to expect, we'll begin the conversation with Mary Newmeyer, Chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality, or EQ, and my partner, Jim Barnett. Following their discussion, we'll transition to a discussion between myself and Dr. Marteza Farajian, Executive Director of the Build America Bureau at the U.S. Department of Transportation, and David Fetui, Acting General Counsel for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. So now, without further ado, I'll hand things over to Jim. Jim, over to you.
Council on Environmental Quality, an office contained within the Executive Office of the President. Mary has a very distinguished and significant public service career. In my view, is highlighted by her time at the House Energy and Commerce Committee, best committee in Congress, where she distinguished herself as bar none the premier Clean Air Act lawyer on the Hill. She's also served elsewhere in the executive branch at both the Departments of Energy and what we call Main Justice. She was appointed Chief of Staff at CEQ early in the Trump administration, and then early last year, the U.S. Senate unanimously confirmed her as chair of CEQ. Madam Chairman, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward in particular to your discussion of the Nepa rule. The floor, or maybe the screen, that is yours.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. It's really a pleasure to be able to participate in this event. As you know, a priority of the administration has been to improve the environmental review and permitting process so that we can build new infrastructure in communities across the country. This has been one of the highest priorities for the administration, to improve the timeliness and the predictability of the permitting process so that we can move forward with new infrastructure, and also so that we can better manage our federal lands, and in addition, move forward with projects that are important for benefiting our environment. So it's really a pleasure today to be able to talk to you about the rule that CEQ issued in July of this year. We issued a rule to update CEQ's NEPA regulations. As I think all of you know, NEPA is a statute that was enacted in 1970. In the early days of NEPA, the Council on Environmental Quality, which was established by the National Environmental Policy Act, and which has a number of responsibilities, but one of its core responsibilities is really to oversee implementation of NEPA. CEQ in the early days issued guidelines, and then in 1978 issued regulations for implementation of NEPA. And these are government-wide regulations. They apply to all federal agencies, and they are intended to assist agencies in conducting environmental reviews for major federal actions that significantly affect the quality of the environment. So the regulations were issued in 1978. They actually have only been revised once since that time. During the Reagan administration, there was a revision to eliminate a requirement that agencies conduct an analysis of worst-case scenarios. But over time, there had been other activity relating to implementation of NEPA. CEQ itself had issued many guidance documents over the years to try to address some of the aspects of the process and resolve some ambiguities. In addition, agencies have developed their own procedures and practices as I think all of you know there has been significant litigation associated with NEPA. It's the most litigated environmental law in the United States, and there are many court decisions regarding all aspects of the process. In addition, over the years, the process has become more complex and can be a lengthy process and a very complicated process. And so Congress has itself taken some actions to help try to expedite and streamline the process, especially for infrastructure projects, certain infrastructure projects. And in addition, presidents have undertaken to try to expedite or streamline aspects of the process. Our rulemaking really began with President Trump's executive order in 2017, which is sometimes known as the One Federal Decision executive order. This is an order that was focused on major infrastructure projects and set a goal of 2 years for completing environmental reviews for major projects. It also, as part of the executive order, specifically directed CEQ to consider potential updates to its regulations. And so we went through a rulemaking process. We proposed a rule earlier this year in January. We received extensive public comment, and we were able to consider that public comment, revise the rule, and complete the rulemaking in July of this year. So the President himself announced the rule on July 15th. It's a rule that is intended to make the process more timely and more effective and more efficient. There are revisions throughout the regulations to better align the regulations with the statute, to codify case law and agency practice and some of CEQ's own guidance. In addition, some of the key elements of the regulations are intended to really improve the management of the environmental review process, and in particular for large infrastructure projects that require an environmental impact statement, we have established a presumptive time limit of 2 years for completion of environmental impact statements, 1 year for environmental assessments. We've also established presumptive page limits and also included a number of provisions that are intended to ensure that agencies work more closely together in a coordinated way, preparing joint schedules, a single environmental review document, a single record of decisions in which permits will be issued. And then we've also included revisions to help improve coordination with non-federal entities. So earlier engagement with the public, providing more information to the public earlier in the process, soliciting more information earlier in the process so that can be considered during the rulemaking, the development of the draft environmental impact statement. And then we've also included revisions throughout to modernize the regulations, to incorporate the use of more modern technologies for engaging with the public and making it easier to understand the process and control the process. So the overarching goal has been a clearer process, a more timely and more predictable process, where we get to a decision. And the President often likes to say it may not always be the decision that the applicant requested, but it's really important to get to a decision and have a process that is predictable and reaches a conclusion in a time frame that will allow for the development of needed infrastructure and will allow for activities that are carried out on public lands to be effectively managed. And as I said earlier, allow for us to carry out restoration projects and other projects that protect the environment, which, like many infrastructure projects, can be delayed by the NEPA process.
Thanks. It is kind of a process rule. I'm interested in the process of the process rule, because in a sense, it's sort of the mother of all rulemakings, right? Where you have not only all of the private sector, public interest, NGO stakeholders, but also you've got to herd all those federal cats. We'll hear from a couple of them later on. Could you just kind of describe that process and how you were able to cut through all that in actually a relatively short amount of time?
Well, it is, as I said earlier, this is a government-wide regulation. It does apply to all federal agencies, and so there are a very large number of agencies that have had a lot of experience with NEPA and have their own regulations and procedures. So the approach we took for the process, and this was a multi-year process, was following issuance of the executive order, we began to work with the agencies. We established an interagency group to talk about better implementation of NEPA, and we began the rulemaking process through an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in the summer of 2018. We then went through the process of developing the rule, working with the agencies as we were developing the rule, and then through the formal interagency review process that OMB conducts. And so this is a rulemaking that did have many interested agencies and many agencies that were active participants in the process, and so it was a very thorough, very rigorous, very robust process involving a large number of agencies, including the agencies that many of those on the phone have probably worked with over the years.
Right. If a central goal of the rulemaking process was to increase the efficiency, I think that was sort of thematically some of the things. How have you accomplished that sort of efficiency in not only the process, but in perhaps preventing litigation, or talk about maybe the one or two things where you've put a bullseye on and worked on in the rule?
Well, in addition to some of the coordination provisions that I talked about a little bit earlier, the development of schedules and single environmental impact statement, which is something that we actually began working on shortly following the issuance of the President's executive order. The agencies actually executed a memorandum of understanding pursuant to which they have been working together and developing schedules system with a 2-year timeline. So there are revisions that we've codified, some aspects of that one set of decision policy that we've codified in the regulations. In addition, we've also made clarifications to some of the definitions that have been the source of a lot of attention and litigation. And in particular, we have clarified or made revisions to the definitions for effects and major federal actions. We have addressed the consideration of alternatives, which is another area that was the subject of litigation. So I would say that the clarifying of some aspects of the regulation consistent with Supreme Court case law and other relevant case law has been one area that we have thought to really help to resolve ambiguity that have arisen in the past.
Yeah. One of the things you said early on was that it's the most litigated statute, environmental statute around, which astounds me given the length and breadth of clean air law, of the Water Act, and other RCRA, other statutes. Is there any concern that that by virtue of the rulemaking process, now that you have a final rule, that it's just going to open the floodgates to more litigation about what the changes to the CFR will mean to participants?
Well, in the rulemaking, and we've described this in the rule itself and in the response to comments, we have what we have sought to do in the rule is really to incorporate into the rule Supreme Court case law, agency practices, some of our own guidance, which agencies have used over the years. And so we really sought to update the regulations to reflect some of the relevant case law and the agency practices and our guidance so that it's all reflected in the current and updated rule. And we think that will be very helpful for the federal agencies as they apply NEPA to projects.
Okay. Tough one. Climate. Can you just talk generally about not only how the rule and the various aspects of the rulemaking process address climate, and anything else that CEQ may be working on in that area?
Well, as you said, Jim, this is a process rule, which is a rule about the process that agencies will follow. In the rule, we have not excluded any consideration of any effects, specific category of effects. We have taken the approach of not excluding any categories of effects. We've outlined and discussed the climate issue in our response to comments, and as we've stated there, agencies may, nothing precludes agencies from considering any effects that are reasonably foreseeable and have a reasonably close causal relationship to the proposed action. In addition, we have included in the regulations a direction to the agencies to consider the affected environment and, as part of the affected environment, consider reasonably foreseeable environmental trends.
Okay. All right. One very specific question. It's on the effective date of the rule. I think today is the 10-day anniversary, isn't it?
That's correct.
Congratulations on that.
September 14th.
The new section 1506.13 states that new regulations, new projects apply to any NEPA process begun after last week, after September 14th. It also states, though, and I'm just reading, that an agency may apply the regulations to ongoing activities and environmental documents begun before the magic date, September 14th. A couple of questions. It's going to be entirely in the agency's discretion as to whether to proceed. All prospective actions will fall under the rule, correct? But it would be under the agency's discretion as to whether to keep the process going under old rules. Is that fair?
That would be a matter for the agency's discretion.
Okay. All right. Is there a time frame in which the departments and agencies will be required to promulgate their own follow-on regulations?
There is. The focus of this is really on the processes that begin after September 14th. In addition, there is a provision in the regulations that directs agencies to update their agency procedures within 12 months of the effective date of the rule, so September 14th of 2021. Agencies that have regulations or internal procedures that implement these pieces of regulations should propose updates to those within 12 months.
Okay. And would those are those APA type proceedings?
Some agencies have their procedures in rulemaking. Others have followed a different approach.
Okay.
And have internal procedures.
Okay, but something to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Depending on how involved with particular agencies you might be.
And as agencies carry out those rulemakings, they will consult with the and go through all the rulemakings.
I see. Can we talk about categorical exclusions? What can you describe the treatment or kind of any differences in the treatment of CEs going forward?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the new regulations address categorical exclusions in more detail than previously, and we've discussed when categorical exclusions may apply. We've also included some provisions to facilitate the use of categorical exclusions where appropriate. Agencies can update their procedures to include additional categorical exclusions where appropriate. But we also have included a provision that would allow agencies to consult with another agency regarding potential use of their categorical exclusion by the agency. And agencies, if they're to pursue this, would include a process in their own procedures outlining how it is that they would consult with the other agency, and then would assure that they would disclose publicly which other agency categorical exclusions they might be applying to their own proposed action.
Okay, I got it. A couple of senior members of the House Resources Committee introduced the so-called Builder Act this week. It's a fairly lengthy bill. I doubt that you and your staff have had a chance to look it over. Do you see a need for legislation to back up any aspects of the rule, or should Congress be taking a look at all this?
Well, I think what I would say, I am aware of that legislation. I think what I would say is really that over the past several decades, Congress has been considering ways to help facilitate a more timely process for infrastructure. So there have been revisions relating to streamlining permitting for transportation projects, for water projects. There have been legislative revisions relating to categorical exclusions, and certainly it's Congress's prerogative to consider those, and we know that for many members of Congress, this is really an important issue for their constituents.
Yeah, I think you and I may have worked on some statutory exclusions in various legislation a long time ago. Looking forward, what's next for CEQ? I'm sure you'll be keeping tabs and assisting all the departments and agencies in their own rulemakings or guidance or however that comes out. But not that you are needing of accomplishments at this point, but what's next? What are you all up to?
Well, in addition to working with the agencies on the application of the rule and the development of their procedures, CEQ does have a broad portfolio, and one of the areas that we've been very focused has been in the area of water infrastructure and helping to promote the modernization of our water infrastructure. In addition, CEQ has been very engaged on federal ocean policy and helping to ensure that the agencies are working effectively together, not just on resource management, but also science and technology. And we work very closely with the Office of Science and Technology Policy on ocean policy, and the President has established an ocean policy committee that we co-chair with OSTP. So we are pursuing ocean-related initiatives, including mapping and characterization of the U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone, which is something that has not been accomplished, but the administration recently issued a strategy to setting a goal of mapping the deep water, U.S. EEZ, by 2030 and the near shore by 2040. So sometimes I did not know that the U.S. EEZ is larger than the landmass of the United States. So,
Right.
So in any event, we also house the Office of Federal Sustainability, which is an office that assists all the federal agencies in meeting their many energy and environment-related performance requirements, and so we have been working very closely with agencies on sustainability efforts, and we'll be continuing to do that.
Is that with GSA and or like federal building?
The buildings, operations of buildings, vehicle fleet, energy use, all of that, yes, is addressed by the Office of Federal Sustainability, but they do work very closely with GSA and with all of the agencies really, but with many of the large agencies that have a very large footprint. That's been another interesting area that the administration has been very focused on helping to promote more efficient federal operations.
Yeah. Speaking of this, here's a gotcha question for you. Speaking of federal fleets, any quick reaction to Governor Newsom's announcement? Under review? Okay. Finally, just in the couple minutes that we have left, this has come in from a number of audience people, any words of wisdom for private sector entities and who do spend a lot of time on NEPA compliance issues? How can they work constructively and productively with federal agencies, with CEQ itself going forward?
Well, I think certainly you'll be working with the federal agencies as they're implementing the regulations. As we discussed, the agencies will be issuing proposed revisions to their own procedures, and so it'll be important that all interested stakeholders participate and comment as part of that process. And so I think that there'll be a lot of opportunities in connection with that effort, and just in terms of implementing the rule, working with the agencies as they seek to achieve the deadlines and really meet the goals of the rulemaking, which is really a predictable, timely process, but also really it's about developing documents that inform decision makers and the public about a potential federal action. So informed decision making is at the end of the day the purpose of NEPA, and to the extent that all of the participants in the process can help to ensure that we have more informed, and better documentation that will help with decision making.
Okay, terrific. Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. I hope it's been helpful, everybody. Cynthia, back to you.
Great. Thanks, Jim. Okay, so we're pleased to have two additional panelists joining us today. First, Dr. Murtaza Farajian. He's the Executive Director of the Build America Bureau at the U.S. Department of Transportation. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Bureau, it's responsible for driving transportation infrastructure development, including access to credit and grant programs. And prior to his current position, Murtaza served as the acting Deputy Secretary of Transportation and was Director of the Public-Private Partnerships, P3, at Virginia DOT. And he also co-founded a crowd financing platform to provide small investors the opportunity to invest in infrastructure. So he brings a wealth of infrastructure experience to our discussion today from the federal, state, and private perspectives. And we also pleased to welcome David Fetui, Acting General Counsel of the U.S. EPA. He's been in leadership at EPA's Office of General Counsel since 2017, but just moved into his current role as the acting GC within the past week. So congrats, David. And prior to joining EPA, David was an attorney in Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher's litigation department. While at EPA, Dave helped shepherd many of the regulatory changes that we're going to talk about today that impact infrastructure permitting, including under the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts. So David, maybe starting with you, I know EPA's got a lot on its plate these days and has gotten a lot of work done in terms of regulatory changes. And so I thought maybe I'd ask you just to hit the highlights and not try and go into all of the different regulatory changes. But what do you see as some of the most important changes that EPA has made under this administration in terms of infrastructure?
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. And it's my pleasure to join you on this panel today. Really appreciate the invitation. And yes, this is week one on the new job, so appreciate the warm welcome. You know, we have been very active in this administration with revising regulations that have important infrastructure components or an overlay to infrastructure development. Maybe I'll touch on a few that come to mind under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. One certainly that's been covered closely is our multi-step regulatory endeavor to repeal the 2015 definition of waters of the United States and promulgate a replacement definition, a rule that we call the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So that took about 3.5 years to complete with multiple rounds of public comment. The new rule was signed by the administrator earlier this year, went into effect in 49 states in June of this year. One district court case issued a preliminary injunction against that rule only in Colorado, but the other sort of preliminary injunction motion, the multi-state sort of nationwide request by a group of states was denied in the Northern District of California. So similar to Mary's experience on the Nepa rule, where a motion for a nationwide preliminary injunction was denied against that rule, and that rule is now in effect. The same is true in 49 states for the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. The Corps of Engineers issues jurisdictional determinations under that rule as to the scope of Clean Water Act jurisdiction. And as of, I think, about a month ago, so my numbers are a little out of date, but they were already up to 700 or so jurisdictional determinations under the new rule in response to various requests. So that, I think, will have a direct impact on infrastructure development because the approach we took was much more what we thought was much clearer than the prior approach. it is still a fact-specific rule, but it doesn't leave things to sort of case-by-case determinations. There are clear lines in the rule. Certainly, you'd have to know about the facts of the water body that you were looking at to determine whether the rule found that to be subject to federal regulatory jurisdiction or only state jurisdiction. But we think that the improved clarity and administrability of the new rule would be a benefit to the regulated community and to states, many of whom have assumed permitting programs under the Clean Water Act. And so maybe that's a segue for me to talk a little bit about permitting generally, but also another one of the rules that we finalized this year, which is the updates to the Clean Water Act 401 certification rule. I think there's a perception that EPA is an agency that issues large numbers of permits, and I think that might be a bit of an outdated perception. We do issue quite a few permits, but states and tribes issue upwards of 95% of all permits under federal environmental statutes because they've assumed or received delegated authority from EPA to run various environmental programs. But our role is still important. We still issue regulations about how those permitting programs are to operate. We still have to review and approve or disapprove a request by a state or a tribe to receive authority to run a program in lieu of a federal program or receive delegated authority. And we certainly provide technical assistance, and we work with states and tribes as they go about running those programs, and we oversee their administration of those programs. And so, one of the rules that we finalized this year was the Clean Water Act 401 certification rule. And so, Cynthia, I'm happy to get into that now, or if you have a follow-up question, I can wait until then, but I can give you a quick overview of that rule. That'd be helpful.
Okay, well, let's use that as a teaser and come back to 401.
Perfect.
Because I do want to sort of move to the funding side just for a second. Sure. So, Morteza, let's get you in on the fun here. And maybe we'll start with the basics, if that's okay with you. Since the Bureau's only been around since 2016 and has sort of an unusual role within DOT, I thought it would be great if you could just give us a little background on the mission of the Bureau and some examples of the types of projects that you work with.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, for providing this opportunity to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do here at the Bureau. As you mentioned, we have been around for about 4 years now, so relatively new. But the programs that they are not new. U.S. DOT has multiple credit programs. These are programs that provide direct loans or loan guarantees to project sponsors or projects that are being financed by private sector in order to facilitate delivery of those projects. So one of the key differences between what we do and what we have heard so far earlier during this panel is that we do have some collaboration with our environmental team and the folks who work on the permitting and environmental studies. But most of what we do is focused on the funding and the financing side of these projects to make sure that when all the permits are in hand, when the project has got all the necessary clearances, the project can actually have enough funding or financing in place so shovel can be put in the ground and the project can be delivered. We have two main programs. One of them is called TIFIA. The other one is called RIF. And I'm not going to explain to you what TIFIA and RIF stands for. It's just the way that the statute works, and we all know that those acronyms are everywhere. But I will just explain what those two programs do. TIFIA, which has been around since, I believe, 1998, provides low-interest loans to project sponsors who want to borrow against future non-federal revenues, build the project today and pay for it over time. So think about it as if you want to buy a house and you don't have cash to go and buy that house all in cash, and you want to get a mortgage for your house. But in essence, that's what it does. We all know that in financial market, there are two main instruments that are already available to borrowers. One of them is the bond market, whether it's municipal bond or taxable bonds that has been available, or the bank loans. What makes TIFIA a little bit different than other instruments in the market is, one, the rates are basically at treasury rates. So when we lend to a project developer, even if their rating is BBB or single A, the rate that they get from us is fixed at treasury rate. For example, for a 30-year loan today, that rate is fixed at 1.4%. We get some budget every year, it's about $300 million from Congress, and we use that money to basically pay for the credit risk premium between the credit risk that the borrower has and really the treasury rates that are the safest type of risks in the market. So we subsidize those loans. That's the simple way to put it. And those loans are pretty flexible. Depending on the needs that the borrower has, we can, for example, postpone the payment of debt service payments for the project or for the loan up until 5 years after substantial completion of the project. So it gives the borrower plenty of time to build the project, especially for projects that would somehow generate revenue in the future, to build the project and then start operating it. And when the project is generating revenue, they collect those revenues and pay the loan back. It's also flexible in the term that if the borrower changes its mind at any given point, they find something that's cheaper than us sometime in the future, they can completely prepay or partially prepay their loan at any given time without any penalty. A couple of other bells and whistles that I can mention, but I just wanted to highlight the flexibility piece, that we actually sit down with a borrower and we come up with a customized solution for the unique problems that their projects may have on the funding side and the financing side. And that's what makes that program very, very attractive. We have had over 87 loans over the past couple of years. Those loans are probably more than $40 billion in total value. And some of them they have been prepaid or repaid. Some of them are still going through that payment stage. Some of them have not started the payment stage. So as of today, we have a portfolio of about $20 billion worth of loans. And we do have plenty of capacity. That's another interesting thing that makes it a little bit different than the grant programs that DOT has, because those grant programs are very competitive. But with loan programs, if a project is creditworthy, they can come to us and borrow. We have about $80 billion capacity in terms of lending power that we have. TIFIA has been used for highway projects, roads, bridges, tunnels. It can be used for any project that is eligible under Title 23 or Title 49, which is basically all the highway projects and all the transit projects. We have another program which we call it RIF, very similar to TIFIA with a few differences. But RIF is mainly for rail projects. So, for example, Amtrak or Class 2, Class 3 rail companies, they can borrow under a RIF program from us. We can pretty much lend to any type of transportation project. There are only a few projects or types of projects that would not fall under one of those two programs. So it's pretty flexible in terms of eligibility, but it's still on a case-by-case basis. We need to sit down with potential borrowers and look at the eligibility. We do have some provisions related to transit-oriented development. So now we can even lend to developers who are making development around train stations, for example. And that's another area that we have recently started exploring. Congress has given us the authority, and this is mainly for real estate, whether it's residential or commercial development around stations. The stations mainly are rail stations. There are certain types of projects in airports that we can finance. There are certain types in ports that we can finance, but everything falls within one of the modes that US DOT has, whether it's federal highway, federal rail, federal transit, or federal aviation. So I will stop just right there. We have another program that we call it private activity bond. Some folks might be familiar with that. It's not a financing tool that we provide. We just provide tax-exempt status, mainly to private companies who are financing projects so they can have access to cheaper debt in market by getting that tax-exempt status from us. Congress gave us about $15 billion authority. We have almost finished it, and I'm hoping that we get a little bit more authority so we can actually allocate more funding under that program.
Perfect. Thank you. That's great. And I think, we just heard Mary talk about some of the changes that have been made to the Nepa regulations and towards an effort of streamlining the Nepa process because it tends to be such a long process, including for infrastructure projects. And I wondered, Mertez, if I could ask you a little bit about that from your perspective, because I know that environmental permitting and the Nepa review process can be a huge risk for infrastructure projects, including P3 projects. A risk in the terms of uncertainty on the schedule and also in litigation risk. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the NEPA process intersects with the credit and funding processes that you just spoke about, and if there's any way the Bureau, what role the Bureau plays, and whether there's any way the Bureau can help manage that process for applicants.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. The Bureau is really the one-stop shop within US DOT, that when people come to us and they start thinking about innovative funding or financing mechanisms, we sit down with them. We actually have a team of experts who provide technical assistance to those who are not as familiar with the environmental process or with the credit review process that we have. So that team sits down with them. We actually assign a point of contact to that particular project, and that person would be in charge of talking to different folks within DOT, whether it's the mode that is responsible for the project, people who are in charge or involved in the environmental process, as well as we have underwriters in-house who would start talking to them about the funding and financing side of it. We also have access to, we're basically under Secretary of Transportation office, so that gives us access to pretty much everyone within DOT, and we can navigate that process pretty easily, relatively easily. And sometimes it could be very complicated for those who are not aware of how things work. But to specifically answer your question about how NEPA falls into the process that we have to follow, we cannot close any loan until a decision has been made on the environmental study. So for us, it's really important to make sure that as we go through the process, we don't want to wait until the environmental study has been done and then start a credit assessment, because then it just takes time, because our process also takes about a year or so to be completed. So we do things in parallel, but in very close coordination with our friends who are working on the environmental study. And we actually have a liaison who is in charge of checking and making sure that everything is going forward according to plan. There are different activities that will happen all at the same time in parallel. Our goal is to make sure that at the end, they all come to the same place and we can close that loan. That environmental risk by far is one of the major risks that we have for projects, because sometimes projects, as go through that process, one, they may see delays, two, project scope may change, and as project scope changes, the funding and financing for the project may change. So that close collaboration between different team members is the key to make sure that we can do things in parallel, save time, and actually get this project to the point that they can put shovel in the ground and move forward.
Great, thank you so much. That's helpful. All right, so I am going to switch back to David for a second. And so as promised, let's get back to 401. So, and I guess, I'm glad that you raised 401, because I think this is something that a lot of infrastructure folks involved in infrastructure world are thinking about, because we've seen so many situations where 401 has become an issue, particularly for natural gas pipelines, but also, with the Millennium Coal Terminal and in other contexts. And so, and I know EPA's rules just came out, just became effective. So maybe if you could start with just a quick explanation of sort of what EPA hoped to achieve with those rule changes, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. I think this was maybe an overlooked section of the Clean Water Act before it sort of started to receive more attention in the infrastructure space a few years ago. But, you know, Clean Water Act 401 says that a federal agency may not issue a license or a permit for an activity that may result in a discharge to the waters of the United States, which again goes back to my previous discussion of the definition of waters of the United States under our new Navigable Waters Protection Rule. But this provision says no federal license or permit unless the state or authorized tribe where the discharge originates issues a certification that would verify compliance with existing water quality requirements, or the state or tribe could waive that certification requirement. So typically, an applicant for a federal license or permit would obtain this certification and whatever conditions that would come along with it, and include that as a part of their submission to the federal licensing or permitting agency. 401 envisions a pretty robust role for states and tribes in the federal licensing and permitting process, but in our view, there are some statutory limits on the role of the state or the tribe in a manner that's consistent with the statute's general cooperative federalism framework, and also ensuring that there is efficient federal licensing and permitting. So our previous rules, our previous regulations that governed the process of issuing a certification under 401 dated back from 1971, and they had not been amended since then. They were even older than what most people come to think of as the Clean Water Act, which was a wholesale reimagining of a 1940s era statute that was passed by Congress in 1972. So our regs were even older than that. So we undertook, at the direction of an executive order, a revisiting of our regulatory scheme. And in July, after a lengthy public comment period, the administrator signed a final rule that went into effect earlier this month. It's been in effect for a couple of weeks now. I'll just hit on a few main elements of the new regulations. Like I said, they were a comprehensive review of the procedure, so there are a number of provisions, but I'll sort of just hit the major ones for our purposes today. So the rule clarifies the statutory language about the amount of time that a state or tribe has, an authorized tribe has, to consider and issue a 401 certification. The statute uses the phrase "a reasonable period of time not to exceed 1 year." And so we sort of emphasize that language means 1 year from the date of when a state or tribe receives a request for certification. We had seen instances of attempts to circumvent the 1 year statutory limitation, with a state suggesting or maybe requesting a permit applicant to withdraw and resubmit a certification request at the 1 year time period to sort of toll the clock and start it over again, or states or tribes using completeness determinations to delay the clock from starting to begin with. So we've said in our regulations that 1 year is 1 year, and it can be shorter if the shorter period of time is reasonable, but we're trying to give some meaning to that statutory provision, and that interpretation is consistent with a couple of recent Court of Appeals decisions, one in the DC Circuit called Hoopa Valley Tribe, and the other a FERC case from the Second Circuit. So that's sort of one key provision of the rule. Another key provision of the rule is about the scope of certification. So what we've said is that the scope of a 401 certification is limited to assuring that a discharge from a federally licensed or permitted activity will comply with water quality requirements, And then we've said a discharge is defined as a discharge from a point source into a water of the United States. So our view is that this provides clarity and an appropriate focus for this regulatory provision of the Act. It's a focus on water quality, and it's a focus on discharges to federally regulated waters. And we've also said that if a state or tribe chooses to condition its certification, those conditions are limited to the discharge itself and not on other potential impacts from the broader sort of licensed activity generally. So if a state is going to issue a certification with conditions, those conditions need to be sort of tailored to the discharge to the waters of the United States. And then just lastly, the third sort of key element here is that we've sort of honed in on this water quality requirements language from the statute, and we've said that that would serve the basis for the state or tribe, for state or tribal conditions, which would be limited to applicable provisions of various sections of the Clean Water Act that are in the statute. So 301, 302, 303, 306, or 307, and state or tribal regulatory requirements for point source discharges into waters of the United States. So I think with those elements and a number of the other procedural elements, like the requirement to conduct a pre-submittal meeting with the state certifying agency and other sort of elements to ensure that the person or the party requesting the certification and the certifying agency at the state level are working closely together, and where the state can obtain the information it needs to make a decision on whether and how to issue a certification. We think this regulation, which which was badly in need of updating, will hopefully produce will result in a more streamlined process that will not drag on for years and years, and will also ensure that states have the ability to participate in those federal licensing and permitting decisions. This rule is being challenged in district courts. We have 5 cases currently challenging this rule. There's a multi-state coalition of about 20 states, and then there's various environmental NGOs. None of those cases, no parties in those cases have sought preliminary relief, preliminary injunctions. So the rule did take effect on September 11th and has now been in effect for a couple of weeks. So that's just an overview and sort of some of the goals that the agency had when taking on this overhaul.
That's great, thank you. And I think 401 is such an interesting piece of the Clean Water Act. As you said, it's not necessarily always well understood, but it's sort of this odd situation. We've got the federal statute where the statute specifically gives states a role,
right,
and it makes it tricky in some ways for EPA, right? Because states have this role under the statute, and there's a limit to how much EPA can control, even through the regulations. So one question I wanted to ask, just to follow up on that, is even after this rule now, if an applicant does face a situation where a state is, let's say, trying to impose conditions under 401 that don't have anything to do with water quality, like that are related to, bike trails or climate change, what recourse do they have?
Well, they certainly could proceed through the state administrative process and then ultimately a challenge in state court. I think that would be the classic way to challenge a state certification. I've seen, and I'm not sort of opining one way or the other on this, but I've seen parties attempt to bring federal court cases based on foreign commerce clause theories or other sort of doctrinal arguments that say that either withholding a certification or improperly conditioning a certification, rises to that level of violating federal law, and have sought to challenge that in federal court. But EPA's role here is we set up the framework for how we think the the certification process should work, and in some ways it's up to the licensing or permitting agency to decide things like, in their view, is a reasonable period of time for their license shorter than a year. And they could issue a rule that says, well, for these types of licenses, we think 6 months is reasonable. Or provide additional guidance through administrative actions that those agencies take. EPA, strangely enough, we sometimes are the certifying agency under 401. So there are times when we are issuing a 402 permit under the Clean Water Act, and like in Indian country, for example, where a tribe does not have treatment as a state, and we are also responsible for then, and we have regs specific to when the EPA is the certifying agency. That's a very narrow subset. So our role here, I think, is sort of, we set the rules of the road. This is our statute. We administer it. There are some sections that the Corps of Engineers administers with us, but this is principally an EPA authority, and that includes 401. So yes, it is a grant of authority to states, but it is in our regulatory scheme and in a statute that we administer. But we are not in a position of grading the work of states on each individual certification. It's not the role that the statute would envision EPA taking.
Thank you. All right, so we're getting a little short time. I want to talk about a little bit about what's next. Morteza, if I can bother you again, there's been a lot of attention recently on extending the FAST Act funding and the potential for a larger infrastructure bill. And I guess you touched on this briefly before, but I wanted to get any other thoughts you had on the outlook for infrastructure funding going forward. One would hope that this is a sort of bipartisan issue, but what are your thoughts on that?
Cynthia, as you mentioned, there are some attempts to hopefully solve that problem, the funding problem. But honestly, my view is that there could be some attempts and it could help a little bit. But to think that we will have that level of funding that is going to solve all of the funding challenges, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Simply because I mentioned earlier, the time to buy houses in cash has maybe passed. What we are doing here at the Bureau is, of course, we are focused on the funding side, but we're also trying to figure out what innovative approaches we can implement to reduce some of the other costs. I mentioned earlier, for example, about the financing cost at 1.3%, how a model can cost 1.3% in terms of financing, but save 4% in terms of construction cost escalation. Those are the type of efficiencies that we are focused on, and we are trying to educate our stakeholders on different innovative models that they can utilize on how to bundle, for example, different projects to create economy of the scale, to reduce on unnecessary expenses in terms of soft costs. So those are the type of things that mainly the Bureau is focused on. And we are actually creating a lot of different initiatives for example, rural projects. We have rural project initiative that even cut those interest rates to half. We just closed a loan for a transit authority, a 30-year loan at 0.7%, to help them to go ahead and build their project faster, build it today, and pay for it over time instead of waiting a couple of years and paying another 20-30% extra in terms of construction cost escalation and other expenses. So those are the type of things that we are focused on.
That was an encouraging note. And I guess I do want to, we're running out of time, but I do want to just give the same question to you, David. Just very quickly, can you tell us anything that's, we're in almost October now, election year, anything that EPA's got on its plate that they really want to get done in the next couple of months? And one thing in particular I'm curious about is whether we might see any guidance about how to implement County of Maui's new groundwater test.
I think we do have some priorities looking to finalize this year. The updates to the lead and copper rule under the Safe Drinking Water Act, the first updates to lead standards in over 25 years. the 5-year review for the ozone and particulate matter national ambient air quality standards. We're looking to finalize both of those this year. We are, as you say, on Maui, the issue in that case was a discharge from a point source that travels to a water of the United States through groundwater. And the question is whether that required a permit, and the Supreme Court issued an opinion that basically said sometimes, and included a number of factors to be considered by the permitting agency. And so, yes, we are considering how to provide guidance to permit writers on how to address the court's opinion in that case. But so I guess I'll pause there. But yes, there are a number of priorities that we're looking to finalize. Two more I'll just throw in. We are looking to finalize our science transparency rule, which will speak to how the agency considers scientific studies and how it views studies where the underlying data is not publicly available. And so that's that's another rule that we're looking to take final action on this year. And then lastly, a rule on cost-benefit analysis and under the Clean Air Act. And that's another proposal where the comment period has closed, and we're looking to take final action before the end of the year.
Okay, sounds like you've got a lot stored in plate. It's going to be a busy couple of months for you. So we better let you get to it. So we're looking up to, and I appreciate everyone sticking with us. And I really want to thank our panelists for joining us. We really appreciate all your insights today and your time. And to our attendees, if you had any questions that you wanted to get out, that you didn't get a chance to send us, please feel free to reach out to me or Jim directly, and we'll be happy to get back to you. And that's it, folks. So thanks so much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.